Oh, well, greetings, my quiver of YouTube followers. What do we have on the bench today? We have my buddy Joe's Marantz Model 510. This is not the 510M with the meters. This is just the 510 without the meters. Same amp though. So it's all been recapped. Let's start here at the power supply section. There are two new main power supply capacitors there, main filter caps. The originals were 10,000 microfarads, and these replacements are 15,000 microfarads. You have to be a little bit careful when you increase the size of main filter capacitors that much. Particularly if there's no choke or no resistor or anything to limit the inrush current. You're going to increase the inrush current, or at least the duration of the inrush, by 50% when you go from 10,000 microfarads to 15,000. Fortunately, this amplifier does have an inrush limiting circuit. It's that resistor under there. I actually have that bypassed right now. It says very clearly in multiple places in the service manual for this amplifier that when you run this amplifier off of an isolation transformer, you must bypass that inrush limiting resistor. So that's what this jumper is doing, and I'm going to get rid of that before I put this thing back together, obviously. So those capacitors were replaced, and on the channels themselves, I replaced all the electrolytics. So these two, that one, that one, that one, that one, this one, and this one. And I replaced a bunch of these older, some of the smaller, lower voltage rated square style film caps with new poly caps. And I tested all of these ones here. They have absolutely no leakage, so they're good. And did the same thing on the other channel, of course. And then on the peak detection board, I replaced all the capacitors in there. I don't know that you can actually see them very well, but there's like 3 or 4 on that board. I also replaced the power light there. You can kind of see the back end of it if I'll zoom in there. So what I did was I replaced the bulb with an original style bulb. Unfortunately, you can't get those bulbs with the wires on them. At least I couldn't find any. But you can find the exact bulbs without the wires. So what I did was I ordered those. They are 6 volt and 0.04 amps. I've got a bunch of them right here. Let's see if I can manage to open this package one-handed and get one out to show you. Crinkle, crackle, crinkle. Here we go. So that's the bulb right there, and as you can see, no wire leads. So I just had to solder some leads onto it and put a little shrink tube over it, and it was fine. But other than that, the bulb is exactly the right dimensions, and it's the right current characteristic, and it seems to be able to allow you to solder the wires to the terminals fairly easy, and the plastic doesn't all melt, so that's a good thing. If you need to order those, here is the Mauser part number for those right there. So if you need those, these work. Now I only replaced the power bulb. I didn't replace the 2 peak bulbs, obviously, because if if you manage to burn out those 2 peak bulbs, you've probably destroyed this amp and several sets of speakers along the way. So those peak bulbs will last forever. Some people, retrofit these with LEDs. Honestly, it's like, yeah, you can do that. I don't see much point. You've replaced the bulb once every 40 years. I mean, hey, whatever, right? Okay, so it's all recapped. And what else did I have to do? I had to replace this fan. The original was a Muffin fan, actual Muffin brand, the model of which is now discontinued. But I found a US Toyo fan, that model right there, USTF 12381. That works really well. and it's nice and quiet. Whatever fan you select for the replacement, if you do wind up having to replace the fan, it has to be able to run on low voltage. There is a dropping resistor right here that basically runs the fan at a very slow idle speed until and unless one of these 60 degrees Celsius bimetallic thermal switches here with the black and white leads, if that kicks in because the channel gets above 60 Celsius, then the fan will go full speed. This other thermal bimetallic switch here is set at a higher temperature. I forget which one, but if that one kicks in, it just cuts the output. So that's a last-ditch effort there to save the channel from overheating if that one kicks in, because it literally cuts the output to the amp. So there you go. So that's all recapped and it's ready to go. So one of the things you have to do after you recap it is you've got to set the DC offset and the output transistor bias. So the DC offset's really easy. It's this pot right here, this trimmer pot right here. By the way, when you go to adjust a trimmer pot like this, don't use a metal screwdriver. If you don't have a plastic screwdriver, what you do is you take a little tweaker driver like this and you put shrink wrap over the blade, because you do not accidentally want to short something out while you're fiddling in there trying to get to this pot. You don't want to blow up the... Yeah, enough said. So anyway, to set the DC bias, you hook up your meter to the speaker terminal outputs of this channel, and you set it to DC volts, and you trim this pot until you get it as close to 0 as possible. It's going to drift a little bit because of the thermal characteristics of transistors. It will drift above and below 0. But you want to get it set right there so that the average voltage on the output is 0. As long as you can do that on both channels, you're in good shape. Then you can set the output bias. And so to do that, what you want to do is you want to attach your probes, and see these four sandcast resistors right here, or whatever these are. You want to get a probe on the bottom of one of these and the top of the other one, or the bottom of this one next to it and the top of that one, either place. So here and here, or here and here, either place. And again, you're measuring DC volts, and you want to then adjust this trimmer here until you have between 18 and 34 millivolts of output, and that will set the bias output correctly. It's a good idea to have the service manual for this before you try to do that. You can download that for free. It's out there. Like Hi-Fi Engine has it. You definitely want to make sure that the amp isn't consuming excessive current. When the thing is biased up and running, it should not pull more than 130 watts. In fact, it should probably pull closer to 120 watts. If you're pulling more than 130 watts, something is using excess current and you need to figure out why. Unless, of course, you've just got it biased so hot that that's the reason. So in any event, you want to adjust this till you get between 18 and 34 millivolts out of here. Doing the other side is a pain in the butt, because getting to the bottom side of that resistor down there is a real pain. What I would recommend doing is, before you put this guy back in and bolt it up to the fan, what I would recommend is going ahead and leaving a little probe like this hooked up to that bottom resistor so that you can take the measurement, and then when you're done, you can kind of wiggle it and pop it off. Getting it on there while this thing is in place is near impossible. Getting it off is fairly easy. So I would just recommend attaching that to that bottom resistor there before you slide this whole thing back in. Now, yes, you could do this setting with this module removed and pulled away from the fan, but if you do that, you're going to get, your readings aren't going to be very stable, because the temperature of this whole thing affects the bias, right? So if I set the bias to 20 and then I just put my hand in front of this fan, within 5 seconds you can see the bias rising on the meter. You can see it rising, up from like 20 millivolts to like 21, 22, 23 millivolts just from blocking the fan a little bit. So if you don't set the bias with it bolted up against the fan like this, it's going to be very difficult to get the left and the right to be more or less ballpark the same value. And again, these bias settings, they drift, right? Because as things warm up and cool down, they change. But the way I set this one up was, the fan running at idle down in a cool basement, and I set it for 20 or thereabouts. So 20 millivolts on each side. And again, the range is 18 to 34. So there we go. That's all set. And everything is ready to go back together now. A couple other things I did. Notice that these circuit boards are connected to the ones behind them with these stab through connectors. You can see it's a sandwich of boards, and the board in the back is where all the power transistors are mounted to, and the board in the front is where all the driver circuitry and stuff is, right? And they connect with these. So before I put those back together, I cleaned them, and I also put a very light coating of Niogel 760G on these pins to prevent any oxidation building up between them, and also to prevent any fretting wear from the thermal contraction and expansion that happens. Deoxit a little bit on the pots, not too much though, because these pots are loaded up with some very heavy grease to make them very stiff. If you use too much deoxit, you'll wash all that heavy grease out of there, and they'll lose that nice stiff feeling. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Tighten up all these spade connectors before you put them back in, clean the lugs that they go onto, all that stuff. So there we go. The amp is now DC offset adjusted. It's recapped, it's biased, and now I just need to put it all back together. And once we do that, we'll hook it up and take some measurements.